Uzma, are you still with us? We can't hear you anymore. Your video has stopped as well. We'll just give Uzma another minute to rejoin. I think she's having some internet issues probably. All right, sorry for the disruption, everyone. Uzma's having some technical issues. She has an unstable internet connection, so she's unable to rejoin, but hopefully she'll be able to join in a few minutes. In the meantime, let's carry on the presentation forward. So Uzma was talking about why this report was written, and to sum it all up, this report is basically written to ensure that with all the rise in algorithmic decision making in Pakistan in various sectors, as the report highlights, so health, criminal justice, judicial decision making. In some of these sectors, the algorithmic decision making is already taking place, but for some of these sectors, it is planned to take place. So our aim here is to ensure that we mitigate those issues and we mitigate the recognized problem of algorithmic bias before it manifests itself fully. With that, we now move forward to the second component of our presentation, which is going to be done by Riham Satti. So Riham is going to explain the concept of human bias and why it matters for artificial intelligence and for algorithmic decision making. So over to you, Riham.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I'm going to touch on a bit about kind of biases and where they come from. And it's a neurological thing. So we all have biases. And biases take multiple forms. And the main cause of them is because we process so much information from the world. And our brains are kind of made of what we call neurons. And these kind of connections in our brains have to try and process lots of information from the world, different stimuli, auditory, olfactory, visual, and all of this information needs to be processed very, very quickly. And so our brain automatically, what it does is it puts things into buckets or groups things together. And this grouping just means it kind of fast tracks a lot of processes, but also builds a lot of biases in the back of it. And there's different types of biases. There are about 140 type of biases that exist in the human brain. Everything from confirmation bias, which is when you end up realizing that a decision has resulted in a positive action, then you can reaffirm your own biases. You've got stereotypes, right? You have halo effect. You've got the Google effect. There's different types of biases that exist in the human brain. And as we make choices, our biases impact every decision that we make. And therefore, when we use machines and technology, these kind of cognitive biases manifest itself into the machines or AI or whatever you want to call it. And therefore that impacts the decisions that come out of the back of these machines. And therefore that results in what we call algorithmic biases. And of course that comes from different reasons, right? It could be based on the data that's being used that's causing, so kind of historical data that is creating machines to kind of be biased or skewed. It could be there's not enough representation in the data that's being used. There could be multiple reasons, but the reason behind algorithmic biases are human biases, really. And there's lots of situations or scenarios where these kind of forms of algorithmic biases have creeped in. Because we're in the world of HR, the classic one that people talk about is the Amazon example. It occurred in about 2015 when they used a machine to be able to shortlist or screen talent. And they used the past 10 years of historical data they had to use this machine and make these decisions. And on the back of that, what was happening was that the system was actually hiring more men than women, or selecting more men to be shortlisted than women. And that doing that in the past, but also another factor could be that there isn't that many women in tech. And so that skewed the decision making, and they had to kind of halt. They've kind of stopped this machine. And so that's a classic example. There's other situations. But like I said, the key thing to take away from this is that we all have biases, and algorithmic biases come in the form of kind of human biases, and they impact every decision that we make. We can never remove biases from the human brain, but what we can try and do is mitigate or postpone them for as long as possible. So that's a quick summarization there for you.
Thank you, Riham. So now with the discussion of human bias, we will directly move onwards to the concept of algorithmic bias. So how does bias manifest itself in the form of algorithms? And for that, I would like to invite Dr. Luke Drew to give his presentation.
Thank you. So algorithmic bias, first, I think it's important to make sure we have a really clear idea of what we mean by an algorithmic bias. And you can think of them as systematic errors. So that is mistakes that aren't caused by random chance, but rather inaccuracies or failings in the algorithm. And the most worrisome of these are when they affect one group of people more than others. There are several ways that AI algorithms typically can develop these algorithmic biases. And in textbooks or Wikipedia, you will find them grouped into all these tens of different categories of different types of algorithmic biases. And I ultimately don't think that's very helpful. I think that the neatest thing to do is to split them into the three ways that algorithmic biases, these systematic errors, can sneak in. Often, AI algorithms are what's called data-centric. And that is that we basically let the computer figure it out for itself. And this is a massive source of bias. All of those human biases that Riham was just discussing will be present in the data that we feed into our computers. And the algorithms just simply learn to copy all of those biases that are present in human brains. This means that to get around it, we need really clean data sets that are examples of best practice decision-making, and it is incredibly difficult to ensure this. At the other end of the spectrum of how one might go about developing an AI algorithm or solution, rather than the data-centric approach, where we just throw loads of data at a computer and hope for the best, we have model-centric approaches. And that's where, instead of just relying on lots of data, we rely on human expertise developing well-motivated models or algorithms. And so an example, a really simple example of this would be an algorithm to predict how high a ball bounces. I could use physics to create a well-motivated equation to predict what happens. And if my understanding of physics is wrong, I might write down a slightly bad algorithm that always over-predicts how high a ball bounces because I've ignored something important. So this is where the algorithm can introduce bias. So this was a nice, neat, simple example where it's really clear to see if I got my physics a bit wrong, I might start predicting that balls don't bounce as high as they really should. In a data-centric approach, what you do instead of coming up with a well-motivated thinking about physics equation is you basically just guess a really complicated equation and hope it works. And this is ultimately what lots of people in data science do. They guess really complicated equations, throw loads of data at them, and hope for the best. And this is then really difficult to disentangle where your bias is coming from. Is it coming from the data that you're feeding it? Are my data bad? Is it coming from my crazy equation? Is it missing some important aspect of the thing I'm trying to model? And if you take just a purely data-centric approach, it's nigh on impossible to figure out what's going on. Whereas if you take a slightly more well-motivated approach where you use experts to help develop your algorithms, it's a bit easier often to see where those biases are sneaking in. And then the third place that biases can sneak in, algorithmic biases can sneak in, are through the loss functions. So that's what's our measure of success. Do we simply care, do all we care about, is it some global, how accurate is the algorithm? And then if you have some very small subgroup of people in your population, we might be getting them completely wrong. But because they're such a small part of the overall picture, I could still get 99% accuracy, even if I get it wrong every single time for one group of people. And so really thinking about what is the measure of success? Is it just like globally, how accurate am I? Or do you want to put something in there to say, actually, no, I also want to make sure that I'm equally accurate for all groups of people? I think ultimately, sort of a little reflection on some of this, if an algorithm is less biased than humans, which we know are biased thanks to some of what Riham was just telling us, is that good enough? And should we make the good the enemy of the perfect? There's lots of talk about transparency, which is very difficult because you can't easily patent an algorithm, at least in Europe. And therefore, if I'm a company that develops a really powerful and successful algorithm, I'm not going to make it public for people to see what's going on because they could just copy it. I have no protection. So that's a difficult one. Also, we have explainability. I think that's really important. AI and advanced statistics can be tough for professionals to understand, but it's vital that we make sure that things that are making important decisions in people's lives are explainable, and we can justify why our algorithms have made the decisions they have. And I ultimately think that one of the only real solutions is to have algorithm audits. And this is expensive. It needs to be done in a way that doesn't stifle innovation from small startups that don't have the resources to audit their algorithms, because otherwise you just end up with big players dominating the field. So that's what I have to say on algorithmic bias in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was a great summary of algorithmic bias for our audience. So moving now from the technical aspects of what human bias and what algorithmic bias is and what it can look like, moving now to the legal issues associated with algorithmic bias, I would like to invite Cecil to talk about what are some of the legal issues or the legal ramifications emerging from the use of algorithmic decision-making. Cecil, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. So I think actually it's a good thing that I came right after Luke, because I think what I'm going to say flows very well with what he was saying. So with specific regards to discrimination law, we know that most countries outside the United States and a few countries require that the person who's alleging discrimination proves at least a high level of correlation between his or her or their protected characteristic and the decision or the prediction that has come out of the system. So in the US and some countries, in fact, what's required is causation. You have to prove causation, not just correlation. But in most countries around the world, a high level of correlation is what is required. Now, the problem there is that for algorithms, machine learning and deep learning algorithms, modern machine learning and deep learning algorithms, it's more or less impossible for anyone to pick out with any confidence which data point specifically has been used by the system to arrive at the prediction or the finding that it has arrived at, the prediction or the decision it's arrived at. So then, if that's what the law says, and that's what the system, that's how the system works, I think that it's obvious then we can see the difficulty we have here. So the old architecture of anti-discrimination law, which requires proof of causation or correlation for discrimination, cannot really be sustained in this age. And that's why I think that what Luke was saying about auditing is really the only way out. So ex post auditing and ex ante auditing, but I think we'll come to that a little later. So that's the problem of causation and correlation is specifically comes out of direct discrimination. This is disparate treatment, as they call it in the United States. When we turn to indirect discrimination, there you don't really need to prove causation or correlation, because all you need to show is that the final result has drastically disadvantaged you on the basis of a protected characteristic. You don't really need to show that there was any intention or anything close to an intention in that regard. But even there, we have a problem. So assuming, so we know that the legal analysis for discrimination starts from, you prove prima facie discrimination. That's for direct discrimination. For indirect discrimination, you don't need to prove prima facie discrimination, so long as there's a drastic disadvantage for you. So then you have to also prove that there is no justification. So it doesn't end at proving that there has been discrimination. There has to be an argument about justification. So the other party could say, I have a justification, and you have to argue that there is no justification. This is also referred to in other places as the proportionality test, right? So is it proportional? Is a tool proportional when you compare it to the aim, the legitimate aim that it's meant to attain? So the problem for algorithmic tools is that how do you prove justification or lack of justification unless you have access to the data, first and foremost, that has been used? Second, unless you have access to the code itself, because the person who's used the algorithm will say that based on the aim I'm trying to achieve, this was the best I could do. And so you can't really controvert that unless you have access to the code and you can show that there is another algorithm that could have arrived at the same result without having the same effect. And so, so those are the problems we see here with regards to burden of proof specifically. The person who's disadvantaged has to somehow come up with the proof that shows that there is no justification. And that's really going to be very, very difficult with modern machine learning and deep learning systems. So that's that problem right there. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Cecil, for sharing your insights on what algorithmic decision-making within the legal realm can look like and the problems associated with it. Thank you very much. Now, moving generally from the legal issues arising from algorithmic decision-making specifically to what the issues look like and can look like in Pakistan, I would like to invite Uzma to share her thoughts on what some of the Pakistan-specific issues are with regards to algorithmic decision-making.
Thank you, Fatima. So one of the most important issues, or rather the threat that algorithmic decision poses, is that to Article 25 of the Constitution of Pakistan, which is right to equality. And as the discussion so far has demonstrated, algorithmic decision-making carries great potential to reinforce pre-existing inequalities represented in our data. So there is great potential for it to violate Article 25. But the problem that we foresee is that of the interpretation of Article 25 in Pakistan. Now, Article 25 is quite broadly construed, and it does not really exclude indirect discrimination, but we can theoretically really interpret it to include indirect discrimination, but we don't really have much jurisprudence in Pakistan to back that up. So before we move forward, I'd really like to bring up one of Luke's eloquent quotes during one of our previous conversations. He said that data science and AI disciplines are not just about the individuals, but they're about the huge data sets that represent many individuals, which means that data can be interpreted by the algorithm across different people, causing indirect discrimination, which can be a problem in Pakistan. So because we don't really have much legal backing for indirect discrimination. Yes, we do have quotas set for women, we have quotas set for minorities. However, we don't really have a concrete legal saying in Pakistan or a case where we can say that, yes, indirect discrimination is recognized in Pakistan. And in any case, it has been largely developed through international law, such as CEDAW in Pakistan. So, however, if I did not come across anything in my research that could say that indirect discrimination is concretely legally recognized in Pakistan. But if someone knows something, please send it my way. I'd be happy to read it. So now keeping this in mind, there are some things that we're concerned about with the current use of algorithmic decision making. So before I was removed from the call due to my unstable internet, I was talking about the use of AI in the judiciary, in the criminal justice system, and in healthcare. In healthcare, let's just begin with healthcare. In healthcare, we're concerned that the data that we have available is largely male data, and women are often misdiagnosed, not just in Pakistan, but also across the world based on male data. And we're concerned that will reinforce this inequality, even though that may not be our direct intention, but this can still happen because that is what the data represents, right? So instead of making diagnosis simpler and more efficient, we might just be making a mistake. And that's why it's necessary to collect good data that is representative of all genders and not just the male gender. So moving on to the criminal justice system, where one area that we're particularly concerned about is the detection of hate speech on the internet. So hate itself is a very complicated subject, and there is no one single definition that can serve all types of hate. So it's mostly a case-by-case decision. Right. So delegating this task to algorithms, it's something that we need to maybe reconsider, or at least put in safeguards that consider what the ramifications of this could possibly be. And in Pakistan, we foresee that wrongful cases of blasphemy might just proliferate due to the use of hate crimes on the internet. And finally, in the judiciary, well, there are lots of issues. One that we particularly highlighted is that of the two-finger test, which was outlawed only recently in Pakistan. And even despite being outlawed and despite, well, okay, a little backtrack again, a little background. In Pakistan, using character as evidence of a rape survivor was legal. And this was, I think, outlawed back in 2016 or 17. But the lower judiciary continues to use it. So if we're going to create a system where the algorithm can recommend to the judge what the decision could possibly be, then it's possible that given our historical data, our huge historical data, which blames the rape survivor on the basis of her character, it's possible that we might just be acquitting rapists again on the basis of survivor's character, which is again outlawed. That is one of the risks. And although the technology which is currently being developed, it has been flagged for everyone that the judge retains the ultimate discretion to come up with the final decision. However, if a sophisticated technology is telling you that this could be the decision, there is However, this technology is still being developed. It's possible for us to intervene and raise our human rights concerns. So these are a few Pakistan-specific issues that have been highlighted in the report and that should be focused on in any state intervention that is made in this subject. That's all I have to say about this.
Thank you very much, Uzma, and our other panelists for giving us this brief yet very effectively put presentation on what algorithmic bias is, how it can manifest itself, and what are some of the legal issues that need to be resolved, mitigated, or avoided in order to ensure that the use of artificial intelligence is rights respecting. So with that, I would now like to commence our panel discussion, which is the second part of this event, where we will have a conversation with all of our panelists on some of the issues that they've raised. And the general theme of this panel discussion is that we are going to try to figure out ways to surmount this clearly identified risk of algorithmic decision making, and also to share some of the best practices that all of our experts from technology and the legal field, they have come across in their work. So I would like to begin by posing a general question to Riham. So Riham, you mentioned that human bias exists and it definitely manifests itself in the form of algorithmic bias. But you also said that the way forward is to mitigate or to postpone human bias. So I'm very intrigued by the use of the word postpone. And I'd like to know more about what you mean by postponing human bias in terms of artificial intelligence. So if you could just shed some light on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so just to kind of summarize that, because at the moment, and I'll give you an example. So in our space, in the HR world, right, the way it traditionally works is when someone is looking for someone to hire, they post a job description and applicants apply, right? And now traditionally, there's two ways this could, what happens after. In some cases, when I mentioned the Amazon example, they had a machine that would kind of decide who should be passed on to the next stage or not. But traditionally, it's mostly a person who is looking at that CV and deciding, have they got the relevant skill sets? Do they have the competencies that matches the job description, and pass them or shortlist them to the next stage of the hiring process? Now, a few challenges manifests just from that there, right? The first one is when you give someone a couple of seconds, and we realize that employers would spend about 6 to 10 seconds looking at a resume, right? In that time, you're scanning and a few keywords pop up. And we in fact did a study where we tracked eye movement of employers, and they'd spend time on someone's name, they'd spend time on someone's location, institution, job title in some cases. And if someone's got a confirmation bias or a halo effect bias or any of those, it will automatically creep in, right? And so about 60% of these cognitive biases take place during that process. Now, what we could do, right, is rather than, and this is a very specific example, is rather than kind of presenting someone's name, which is not it's not important, right? In the hiring world, why do you need to know someone's name on a CV, right? Or why do you need to know what university they went to, right? It's more about have they got the skills, the qualifications, rather than where they went, right? And so what you could do is redact some of that information, right? Or withdraw some of that information. So that means that rather than someone spending a few seconds on someone's name, they're looking at what skill sets or roles or responsibilities could that person do. So you're recalibrating someone's eyes, right? Or you're recalibrating someone's decision-making so that you're trying to then postpone it for as long as possible. Because like I said, you're never ever going to be able to remove biases from the human brain, right? Because they will always creep in at some stage of the process. But if we can put safeguarding processes along the way, right, and reveal information later on, that could be an example, then you're actually postponing some of these biases for later on. So if I not show you university name now, but I show it to you when you're at the interview stage, then it's not going to have as big of an impact, right? And therefore you're kind of actually trying to dampen these biases. And so you can put some kind of guidelines or processes, and that's kind of one of the kind of processes behind techniques like blind recruiting, right, which is where you try and withhold some of this information. And so that's what I mean about kind of postponing or trying to mitigate it. And there's different situations you can apply in other sectors as well, but that's an example.
Thank you very much, Riham, for explaining exactly how you can postpone human bias, especially in the recruitment process. So that's just a great example of how you're actually doing it, practically speaking. And I think that's a best practice that we can all look to, both here in Pakistan and in other parts of the world, because that's been proven to be possible. I think we can all learn something from that. So just now moving towards Luke. Luke, you mentioned that the solution to all of the problems that we've been discussing about traceability, explainability, and transparency, you said that the solution lies in audits, right? In algorithmic audits. So could you please explain or just try to shed some more light on what exactly this audit consists of, and what can it bring forth and how it can help us? That would be great.
Sure. So, right. So I'd just like to make clear that I don't think it is the solution in and of itself on its own. I think that we need a few things, and reflecting again on what Riham was saying, some problems are really well suited to using AI to solve and others aren't. So problems where people have to make decisions quickly, perfect use case potentially for AI to come in and help. Where people have a large amount of time to make decisions, such as when Uzma was talking about judges deliberating on people's sentences, maybe that's not such a good use case or a useful use case for AI. But reflecting then on these audits, again, sort of with what Cecil was saying, that most of us aren't AI and machine learning specialists. And so if we're leaving it to individuals to prove that some fancy algorithm and data set is biased against them, they aren't, like 99% of people on the planet aren't going to be able to do that. And so we have to have independent experts come in and give things a stamp of approval or a score or something, right? This is obviously requires some wider discussion than I can't just invent it myself. But the important parts of it would be, where are the data coming from? Are the data representative of the people or that are going to have decisions about them made? The algorithm that's being used, can the developers justify why it's being used, and then demonstrate its accuracy on a range of metrics? So as a society, we have to decide what is fair, what counts as discrimination, again, sort of reflecting on what Uzma was saying. And then we need statisticians and data scientists to, on a case-by-case basis, and probably lawyers as well, actually, on a case-by-case basis, to take what we've decided as a society and turn it into statistical tests. And we can then test an algorithm and see how it compares. I mean, interestingly, we don't do this to human decision-making, right? In an ideal world, every time humans are making these decisions, we should be applying exactly the same process. I guess the one defense about human-powered decision-making process is it tends to be a bit more understandable to a layperson. But I think that it does require this amalgam of lawyers, philosophers, statisticians and data scientists to test each algorithm on a case-by-case basis. And it would have to be done in a way such that startups or small companies can still bring a product to market without the large cost that this would probably entail, because otherwise you'd only have large companies being able to afford it. So there are very real problems with this approach, in that you don't want it to stifle innovation and leave it only to massive conglomerates as the only people that can use AI to solve problems. So there's definitely problems with it, but I think the solution is to bring lots of people together, and probably we would also need to bring economists in and business people, because it will involve probably taxing organizations, disproportionately taxing larger organizations more to help fund this process for smaller ones. So it really is an interdisciplinary problem that needs to bring lots of people together, but in particular the statisticians, I think.
Yeah, that's great, Luke. And I like how you're taking the multi-stakeholderism to an entirely new level here with this, and why it's so important for these audits as well, because they reflect such a diverse range of interests and people. It is only just and it's only equitable if all of those people are consulted. So
absolutely. Very quickly, so in Mevitae, this is what we're sort of doing in-house, right? This is the approach that we've taken in-house to when we're deploying algorithms to solve problems. And hopefully it's what lots of good, like good companies are doing, but lots of them aren't. So
yeah. So another example of best practice for companies developing algorithms themselves. So they need to have this diverse set of leadership as well as employees working there and to ensure that all of these problems are mitigated. So with that, let's now turn to some of the legal issues that have been raised by both Uzma and Cecil. So Cecil, you raised the issue of the burden of proof, and it's a big problem, both in terms of trying to bring the claim and then also trying to prove it. So my first question to you is has this problem actually manifested itself? So in your research, have you come across examples where this problem has manifested, or is this just right now, is it just a prediction that is very likely to occur in the near future? So that's my first question to you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So can I start with some comments just from what Luke has said?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so interesting. I think that first of all, the judges making decision problem. So I think for developing countries, what Luke says is decisions that would require time are in fact decisions that functionally we want to do faster, because I don't know about Pakistan, but in Kenya, huge backlogs for judges in courts. And so the time thing is actually a pressing concern for even decisions you would imagine need to be done with more time, which creates an even bigger pressing concern for the use of AI in such places and the risks that come with that. Anyway, and then, yeah, I thought the comment on the multi-stakeholderism was really interesting. And I remember that in one class I took, a professor was saying that maybe it's time for even law students to start doing data science, some element of data science, or some element of computer science, because imagine a world where all decisions, well, a lot of decisions are being made like that, and you just need to have some level of knowledge for you to be able to be cautious enough with the use of those kinds of tools. So I thought that was something worth thinking about. Anyway, so with regards to your question, Fatima, the problem with this issue of burden of proof is that it's really hard for you to see it, because the case has to come before you're able to see that there was a problem, because nobody who has endured discrimination by computer system, they just don't know. For the most part, they don't know that it's going on. And so just like normal discrimination as well, like most people don't, well, not most people, but a good number of people might not realize that they're being discriminated against until the very end. So it's kind of impossible to know that the problem is, to prove that the problem is going on. But I think that if you just think about the dynamics, especially in developing countries, it's almost certain that this is what will happen, or this is what will happen for places that are using these kinds of tools, just because now human decision making is itself really complicated, and many people, at least in my country, Kenya, might be discriminated against and they have no idea. So imagine the case for algorithmic decision making, in which you don't have any access to how the system works, how the system, what sort of data the system has been trained on, and all those kinds of things. And so I really think it'll be a major concern. One thing to add there is that even if you do have a hunch that it's going on, the resource constraints of possibly hiring an expert witness to sort of go ahead and prove to the court that this is a problem will be pretty difficult to overcome for a lot of people. I have some thoughts on like how we can fix that, especially in developing countries, but they're not perfect thoughts. They're just like initial thoughts. Yeah.
Cecil, we'd really like to hear some of your not perfect initial thoughts on how that can be solved. If it's okay.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing that's really concerning in developing countries specifically is that there's just the state itself doesn't involve itself in discrimination that's going on. Yeah, basically, like you will never find the state or government agencies actually launching cases on behalf of people. So investigating cases and launching them on behalf of people. This goes on a lot more in developed countries, where, for instance, you see the New York Finance Board launching a case against Apple Card. I believe it was Apple Card or something, on account that they are discriminating, or the Department of Housing in in the United States launching a case against Facebook for discriminating against Black people when advertising for housing. So you see that a lot more there. But in my country and in the countries I studied, the 5 countries I studied, you just don't see the state involving itself in policing discrimination like that and bringing cases on behalf of people. And I think that it's absolutely necessary that the state starts to do that in the age of algorithmic decision-making, because of the burden of proof problems. So you need an outside institution that's powerful enough to police it as much as it can and bring cases on behalf of people. And I just think that the only solution is an institution with the kind of resources that a government has.
Thank you very much, Cecil. So just taking your comment about state involvement forward and putting this now to Uzma in the Pakistani context. So Uzma, you've also highlighted some of the very specific legal problems that can potentially arise in Pakistan. So what are your thoughts on the state involvement aspect in sort of mitigating those potential problems or resolving those problems? So simply put, what can the state do?
So I think the first step for Pakistan should be that recognize it on a state level that this is a human rights issue. Recognize that there are risks that AI poses, because at the moment our focus is only on the opportunities of AI. So now, having said that, I think Pakistan should adopt a bit of a different approach than what is being done globally. So globally, the discourse is developed on the basis of ethics, and ethics are not legally binding. Ethics do not have a legal remedy. So if we approach the subject according to law and look at it through a legal lens, and more specifically through the lens of constitutional law, because right to equality is at risk. So I think Pakistan should look at it through a human rights law lens and recognize it as a legal issue. Apart from that, I think one of the best...
Joined a meeting,
sorry. Okay, so I think one of the best practices that has developed recently in Europe, it's still under consultation. It's under a proposal for legal regulation of AI. And I think this would be the very first legal regulation of AI. And they've decided to define what AI is. And they've decided to define it through a risk-based approach. And they've decided the different types of risks that AI systems can pose. So there are unacceptable risks, there are limited risks, there are minimal risks. And I think that's a good approach, because it seems that the world is going to use algorithmic decision-making in any case. So apart from recognizing it as a national issue, Pakistan should also develop an AI strategy that balances human rights along with the risks that it poses. Because like Riham said, that biases and unfair biases, they cannot be eliminated, they can only be mitigated. So we need to put in those policy and legal safeguards that can help us mitigate these biases. And I think one of the best practices that the state should develop is for collecting good and updated and representative data instead of using historical data, because we know historical data is biased. We need to put in that effort. And if we can invest in the opportunities of AI, I think we can also invest in addressing its risks. So those are some of my thoughts on what the state could do. Oh, and also I think the youth should get more involved since we're using the youth to, Pakistan is focusing on the youth and educating it on AI. I think there should be more focus on educating the youth on its risks as well. And the youth should take the leadership in taking control of their future.
Thank you, Uzma. And sorry for just briefly cutting you there, but one of our panelists, Riham, has to leave shortly. So before she leaves, I'd just like to say goodbye to her and thank her for joining us today and sharing her insights with us. So thank you very much, Riham, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks for inviting me, and lovely to kind of take part in this such an important discussion. So really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for your time. Take care. Bye.
Bye, Riham. All right. So just to wrap up some of the things that we've taken away from this panel discussion before we move on to our Q&A session, I think the first thing that we all agree on, and by we I mean all the panelists, is that there is the need to mitigate algorithmic bias. So that's decided. And then secondly, what all of our panelists also believe in is the importance of multi-stakeholderism at a much greater level than it's currently occurring. So Luke mentioned the involvement of technology experts, economists, philosophers, lawyers, all of these. And then Cecil added to that, and Uzma also added to that by talking about how to engage the youth, how to engage law students. So starting multi-stakeholderism from even below that level of professionalism, right? So that's a very important takeaway from this session as well. And then the solutions that we've come up with. So firstly, talking about from a technical aspect, algorithmic audits, then talking about some of the problems associated with those audits. From a legal perspective, we've talked about the problems associated with bringing a case related to discrimination on the basis of algorithms, what the state can do, what the state cannot do. What are some of the problems specific to developing countries? And those problems, as we've realized, all boil down to resource constraints, right? So we cannot afford to have technology experts intervene every single time that a case needs to be brought. So what can the state do? That's still an open question, and one that needs to be resolved on a priority basis, especially in developing countries, which is not yet fully attained that level where all our decisions are being made by algorithms. We're still starting out. So there's still a lot of room, a lot of scope, and a lot of momentum for just recognizing this right now and mitigating it before it translates itself into a full-blown emergency, which then we cannot tackle already because our justice systems face these difficult problems of judicial backlogs, etc. So with that, I will now open the floor for questions and answers. And I would request anyone who has a question to please use the raise hand feature and then unmute yourselves. Once I recognize you and the floor is yours, you can ask the question. If anyone's more comfortable sending in questions to the chat, that also works fine.
I don't know if I can go ahead and ask something to Luke, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
So I'm curious about the. I'm not sure. I probably don't know exactly what your company does, but I'm curious what you think about private auditing. So let me a little bit explain. So some companies have hired some companies that are about to deploy algorithmic tools have hired other companies to do auditing for them and give them reports. And I've read some stuff about this, and I'm getting the sense now that it's being used mostly to whitewash the algorithm. So they have the report that says, this is, and they don't have to publicize the report as well. So I'm just very curious what you think about generally, what you think about this kind of private auditing of algorithms. Yeah.
Yes, so I think ideally it wouldn't be private, right? And we would have national or international systems in place and an accepted standard of how we do these things, but that doesn't exist. So people have to go just on a sort of on their best efforts approach. And undoubtedly, some organizations will be using a whitewashing approach, right, where they're sort of doing it as a tick box exercise and calling it a day. You've also got the problem that only large or very well-funded organizations will be able to afford the kind of things you've just talked about. So at Mevitae, we do it in-house, and we haven't released products to make them commercially available because they haven't passed those tests in certain cases, right? Our own internal ones, and we could have done, and we could have sold them, and I'm sure we could have made money from it, but that doesn't fit in with our moral compass of what we think is right. And actually, ultimately, it would be damaging to our brand, right? If down the line people start complaining that our algorithms don't do what we say they do. So for us, it's vitally important we get it right. And so each of our products that we do have released, we have put through these kind of tests. So we're in Mevitae, we're in the recruitment space, and so we make sure. So our main product that's commercially available at the moment is a blind recruitment tool. So it will take a CV and automatically go through and redact information that we think could be causing unconscious biases when people are looking at a document for just a few seconds. And we've tested with CVs that we think are representative from large different numbers of groups of people, and check that our algorithm works just as well on all of them, right? And that was really important to us, that worked before we made it publicly, before we started selling our algorithm. And so it's a case-by-case basis. We did that in-house because, well, we can't afford to pay some large organization to, and we also luckily had the expertise to do it. And we think that we're doing a moral thing, so we like to think that we aren't bad guys. But yeah, so ideally there would be a public body that would do this. And yeah, the funding of it is difficult because you couldn't expect startups to be paying for that kind of thing because they wouldn't be able to. So you just have lots of products not come to the market. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
All right, thank you both Cecil and Luke for posing the question as well as answering it. That's absolutely great. So we now have a few questions from our audience, and I'd just like to go through them one by one. So the first question that we've gotten is by Samiha, who asks whether mistakes or discrimination made by AI or algorithms qualify as a sort of negligence in tort in legal systems. So any of our two legal experts, feel free to jump in response to this question.
I'll go first. I think that's an interesting question, and that is something that should be put into the debate as well. I'm not sure if it can qualify because it does not really qualify as a legal thing right now. Per my knowledge and per my research, it's only an ethical issue at the moment. But I think in the US there are a few cases which say that there has been discrimination, but I may be wrong. Cecil must have more information on that. But yes, I did come across one article which is trying to argue that perhaps the issue of algorithmic unfairness could be used as it could be circumvented through tort law. I am not sure how to answer this question because it's not resolved yet, but I think it should be put into the debate. And I guess it could be.
Yeah, Cecil, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I think that when you get into the nitty-gritties of how tort works, it doesn't fit in very well, and that's why it's not considered well by the consensus as it stands right now is that that's not that wouldn't be a very viable way forward. I have not actually seen the article that has said that, so I'd love to see it later. But I think that when you get into the nitty-gritties of how tort is organized in most countries, that's where the problem comes in. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that a bit more and to connect it to what Cecil you said earlier. So for example, in a lot of the tort systems across the world, including the UK, there's a compulsory requirement of causation, right? And that just brings home the whole debate that Cecil, you had regarding the problems associated with causation, especially with regards to indirect discrimination. So that's one particular area where it is actually hard to prove negligence because that essential component won't be satisfied, right? So the next question is from Aksa, who has asked, just a minute. We've established that the bias manifests in research and subsequently policy making, but how can we remedy this or repair the damage that it has done? So this is an open question, anyone can answer it.
So there's something I think that is worth considering here is that I think it's important for people to have the ability to request a review of any decisions that are made on their behalf. So this works with something where the decision making isn't the impact of the decision isn't too instant. So if the decision is, do you qualify for a loan or not, I can request a manual review from a human being, and that might go some way to remedying this to some extent. It's not perfect, but it helps. If, however, the decision making is on a much finer timescale, such as administering some drug, there's an algorithm that decides how frequently it has to administer some drug to you. If it starts suddenly giving you an overdose, you might be able to request a manual review, but you might be dead before the manual review takes place. So that works for certain types of decisions made by algorithms, and others it definitely doesn't. And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, thank you, Luke, for your answer. So one more question, and this is from Drew. What is the panel's views on the distinction made by the ECHR or the UK Data Protection Act between decisions taken by algorithmic systems and significant decisions? Should a regulation of significant decisions taken by algorithmic processes happen at a higher threshold? And additionally, should that include not just legal effects, but also include decisions taken by commercial entities, such as loan applications or recruitment applications? So, and sorry, he meant the GDPR, not the Data Protection Act. So again, I think this is more of a legal question, and any of our two experts can feel free to jump in.
I guess I can start. So I think that it's a rational thing to do, to require to sort of split the decisions into some kinds of decisions that would require a higher threshold of review than others, given the expectation that there will be very many algorithmic tools running in the environment. I should confess that I don't know the details exactly of what the GDPR says should work, but I think the general idea makes sense to me. Of course, in my opinion, actually, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the decision about how to categorize them, so how to categorize them specifically, which decision fits this scenario, and which one does not fit this scenario, and therefore can do with less significant review, is a very value-based decision. And I feel like there's no real way to go around the fact that all of them will have effects on human beings, and it's important to just keep in mind that there's still a lot of that decision is a value-based decision. And personally, if we could find a better way to make sure that all of them, all the algorithms go through some significant testing, stress testing before they are deployed or required of that, it would be better off. And so one of the promising things that's going on is I think that there are AI companies working on computerized, of course, Luke could explain more or correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are computer scientists working on using AI to review AI. And I feel like that might help a little bit with this problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Cecil. So we just have one more question, and I think that's going to be the last question before we wrap up. And this question is from Isam, who asks, Can algorithmic bias be remedied through judicial review, notwithstanding its desirability? I recall the Court of Appeal in the UK criticizing the Horizon computer system and quashing convictions on account of defects in that system. But are there other examples to your knowledge where the flawed or biased workings of an algorithm have brought before a judicial forum?
Yeah, perhaps I can take this again. Yeah, in the UK again, just very recently. Absolutely. What's it called? Look, I feel like you could. It's called. There's this new NGO in the UK that took the case on with regards to the IGCSE algorithm to court. And I can't remember the name of the group. But so they were. You can go ahead. It's okay.
No, I was just to say sorry. I don't know what it is you're talking about.
Yeah. It was. Yeah. Can you give me a moment? Let me just open it really quickly because I have it right here with me. It's called.
So somebody just messaged in the chat and they've said that it's called Big Brother Watch.
Yeah, I don't think it is that one. I think it's just one moment. It's opening right about now. Foxglove, yeah, Foxglove. I don't know if you've seen what they've been doing. Foxglove. They took the case. They took up the case on the IGCSE exams algorithm, and there's actually pleadings that have been filed and everything until the government caved in eventually. And I believe there was an immigration algorithm as well that they had just begun. Actually, that went further, the case for the immigration algorithm. So the UK government was using was preparing to use an algorithm, but actually used an algorithm for determining who got immigration status and who didn't. And Foxglove took the case up again, and that one proceeded even further than the IGCSE case. I think the government eventually settled and stopped using the algorithm. But I guess I've not yet seen a court actually going all the way yet. Yeah,
so
I'm not sure.
We had a good example of it didn't even get to court in the UK. During COVID, school children weren't able to sit their exams, and our government decided it wanted to use an algorithm to decide what results to give people. And it lasted all of probably a week or two. And the government backtracked and said it would just use teachers' predicted grades because there was such outcry from the populace. So that didn't even get to judicial review. It didn't have to. People were so outraged by an algorithm that they thought was inherently unfair, which it was, that the government had to completely change tack. I mean, it's interesting that it got that far and our government didn't realize it was a bad decision when they were making it. But there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to send Fatima the papers for the immigration case. They were very interesting. The pleadings for the immigration case were really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can definitely share those with our participants after this meeting as well. So that wraps up our Q&A session as well as our event. I would just like to thank everyone for joining in and our panelists for giving their insights, having this discussion with us, for contributing to our report, and also for taking time out today to answer all of these questions. And so that's pretty much it for today. I've sent out the report to everybody who registered for this meeting. So I hope that everyone gets a chance to go through the report. And if anyone has any questions or follow-ups or constructive criticism, we are an organization that's very open to dialogue and very open to talk to you about some of those concerns. So please feel free to reach out to us once you've read the report or if you're still reading it. And if you have any questions that any of our experts can answer, we'll be happy to forward those questions to them as well. So thank you, everyone, and we will call it a day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.